In social studies, we've been talking about being change makers. And yesterday we read about a Black woman change maker. And today we're going to read about one of our Black men change makers that we may not have all heard about. So we're going to learn about Thurgood Marshall, who was actually a justice on the United States Supreme Court. And even though he can be very famous and people know him for that, there's a lot that people don't know about his life. Thurgood Marshall was born in 1908 and he died in 1993. Thurgood, later shortened to Thurgood, was a naturally argumentative boy and a bit of a troublemaker. His punishment for talking too much was to memorize the US Constitution, which was probably not the worst thing for him, considering that one day he would become one of the world's leading constitutional scholars. By the time he applied to college, Thurgood knew he wanted to be a lawyer. He hoped to attend the University of Maryland School of Law, but couldn't because he was Black. The anger and frustration about that instilled in him a deep desire for justice and equality. Instead, he earned his law degree from the historically Black college, Howard University. Not long after graduation in 1933, Thurgood began working with his mentor Charles Houston, for the NAACP. He wanted to help fight for civil rights. Their major goal was to overturn the US Supreme Court ruling that segregation was legal if the segregated facilities were separate but equal. Black people in America knew that their facilities were nowhere near equal and that they had nothing close to the same opportunities as white people. Thurgood had proof. University of Maryland School of Law. He and Charles made the case to Maryland state courts that in order to uphold the separate but equal law, University of Maryland would need to have a second school that admitted Black students. In 1936, they won. It was the first in a long line of cases they brought to take down legal segregation. Then, in 1954, Thurgood brought the case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka to the US Supreme Court. It was the landmark ruling that would lead to the end of legal segregation in the country. In 1967, Thurgood was appointed as an Associate Justice to the US Supreme Court. He would be the first African American justice. In his long career, he was well known for his constitutional knowledge and even helped the United Nations draft the constitutions for the newly formed countries Ghana and present-day Tanzania. Thurgood spent so much of his life fighting for justice. It was a long road, but he never lost hope. So interesting that he is definitely a very big change maker, but the case that they talked about, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, happened 7 years after our case that we learned about in California. So this one happened first with our friend Sylvia, and remember her family was from Mexico and they had Mexican schools. And then 7 years later, segregation for the United States was banned for schools. So I love learning about our change. Today, we're going to continue our talk about change makers. And I want you to think about these two questions. How do we change something that is not fair? And how can I be a change maker? So two different questions. How do we change something that is not fair? And how can I be a change maker? While we're thinking of our answers to these questions, think about what you would be doing as a change maker, saying, thinking, feeling. Down here at the bottom of our slide, we have a variety of change makers in the world for many different reasons. Oh, there's our friend, United States Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. We just learned about him. That's a real picture of him. But it also looks like we have some indigenous peoples change makers. It looks like we have some Mexican change makers. And maybe it looks like we have some Asian change makers. So change makers aren't just blacks and whites. They are a bunch of people. So how can we change something that is not fair? And how can I be a change maker? This book is called Schomburg, The Man Who Built a Library. This book is a Coretta Scott King Honor winner, and it's written by Carol Boston Weatherford, and it's illustrated by a Pura Belpré Award winner, Eric Velasquez. So even though this is what we call a picture book, this picture book actually has a prologue in it. And we learned about prologues with our read aloud book, but this says a bibliophile. That means somebody who likes books. Arturo Schomburg was more than a book lover, more than a mailroom clerk at Bankers Trust, where he supervised 11 white men, unheard of authority for a black man at the time. He recognized early that history was not history unless it was complete from all angles. Like a detective, he hunted for clues and found facts affirming the role of African descendants in building nations and shaping cultures. Fellow book collector Arthur Spingarn noted that Arturo would approach an immense pile of apparently worthless material and unerringly find one or two treasures, which would have been lost to a less inspired collector. Arturo believed that those facts, once unearthed, would speak loud and clear in halls of knowledge, daring another teacher to tell a black child that the Negro has no history. Time and again, through print, music, and art, Schomburg proved otherwise. On his lifelong quest, he was not just collecting rarities, he was collecting history for generations to come. He wanted the facts to reach the community and boys and girls in the classroom to teach them that Black heritage knows no national boundaries. And today, the Harlem Library, bearing Schomburg's name, boasts more than 10 million items, bringing to light past glories that Arturo always knew existed. Wow. Those great pictures. It says 5th grade. Arturo Schomburg was born with a sense of wonder. As a boy in Puerto Rico, he shadowed tabaqueros, cigar workers. These men pooled money to pay a lector to read aloud in the factory. Newspapers, novels, speeches, and politics. Arturo took in the scent of cured tobacco and the sound of the reader's voice. Thus, Arturo not only learned his ABCs, but also to love the written word. So when his 5th grade teacher told him that Africa's sons and daughters had no history, no heroes worth noting, did the twinkle leave Arturo's eyes? Did he slouch his shoulders and hang his head low and look to the ground rather than to the horizon? No. His people must have contributed something over the centuries, history that teachers did not teach. Until they did, school children like Arturo would not learn of their own heritage, ignorance shackling them like chains. After that teacher dismissed his people's past, did the twinkle leave Arturo's eyes like a candle blown out in the dark? No. The twinkle never left. It grew into a spark. So in 5th grade, they're saying he already had a spark to be a change maker. Genius. Where is our historian to give us our side? Arturo asked, to teach our people our own history. Afro-Puerto Rican Afro-Boricño, born in 1874, young Arturo Schomburg began a lifelong quest. Still a boy, he took on the mantle of historian because he had to know the truth. In a history club, he noticed the white youth seemed prouder of their heritage than the black members. Arturo read everything he could about his people, but he did not hurry. He let facts simmer. True scholarship requires time and calm effort, he figured. Nothing worthwhile is done in haste. After all, there were ages to traverse. Lost for hours in books, Arturo was transported by Benjamin Banneker's almanac to early America. Arturo studied all he could with his self-taught inventor, astronomer, and draftsman. He beamed as he read that Banneker accurately plotted a solar eclipse. Arturo could almost hear the tick-tock of Banneker's handcrafted wooden clock, the first built in the New World. Arturo imagined Banneker counting off minutes, racing time to redraft plans from memory for the streets of Washington, D.C., after French architect Pierre L'Enfant walked off and carted his papers with him to Europe. Banneker reproduced them in only 2 days. The nation's capital, in 2 days, by heart. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Where were the monuments to this genius? El Immigrante, the Immigrant. When 17-year-old Arturo Schomburg immigrated to New York from Puerto Rico in 1891, he carried with him letters of introduction from cigar makers and from Jose Gonzalez Font, who owned a printing press in San Juan, where Arturo had worked as a typographer. Arturo presented the letters to Flor Berga, an amateur book collector and staunch opponent of Spanish colonial rule. Arturo perused Berga's photos and clippings about New York's Puerto Rican community and soon found the local tabaqueros. This time, he lived among them, sharing their activism and allegiance to Cuban and Puerto Rican independence from Spain. In support of La Casa, the cause, Arturo joined political groups such as Las Dos Antillas, the Two Antillas, and wrote letters to the editor of the newspaper Patria under the pen name Grenaux. Newly arrived, Arturo sought to better himself, giving Spanish lessons while learning English in night school. Drawn to medicine and law, he pursued neither because, as the story goes, his official school records were lost in a fire. Not even a letter from a former teacher was sufficient proof of his formal education. Kindergarten was all that could be documented, so Arturo set aside dreams of a profession and toiled as a messenger and clerk at the law firm that was seeking to protect Johnson & Johnson's use of the Red Cross logo on its products. For that case, Arturo indexed and memorized thousands of pages of testimony. His recall of detail was extraordinary. We're going to stop